5 Turkish soldiers have died after exposure to methane gas on Sunday while searching a cave in northern Iraq for the remains of a fellow soldier killed by Kurdish militants in 2022, the Turkish Defense Ministry said. According to Associated Press, soldiers were searching a mountain cave when 19 of them were exposed to the gas, which is colorless, odorless, flammable and can cause asphyxiation in sufficient concentration. They were immediately transported to the hospital, but despite all interventions, 5 heroic personnel were martyred, the ministry said in a statement. Rescue operations in the area continue. The ministry did not give a specific location for the incident other than the Clawlock Operation region, a reference to an operation launched against the Kurdistan Workers Party, or PKK, in North Iraq in April 2022. The Turkish unit affected by methane gas was searching for the remains of an infantry officer killed by terrorist gunfire during a search and clear operation in May 2022, the ministry said. For the last 3 years, teams have been hunting for his remains. The cave was at an altitude of 852 meters and was known to have been used as a hospital by the PKK in the past, although it had since been cleared by Turkish soldiers. The office of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said the soldiers were exposed to a high concentration of accumulated methane gas. Turkey and the PKK have waged a 40-year conflict which has often spilled over into Iraq and Syria. Turkey has set up a series of bases in northern Iraq, where the PKK has been established for decades. The PKK, which is considered a terrorist organization by Turkey and most of the West, announced in May that it would disband and renounce armed conflict as part of a new peace initiative with Turkey. Its fighters are expected to begin handing over their weapons over the next few days in the first concrete move toward disarmament.
Russians are rapidly becoming poorer amid the war, but the Kremlin has found a simple way to explain why their utility bills have risen to historic highs. Thousands of paid bots on social networks tell Russians that this is not ruin but normal practice and their price for stability. Since June the 1st, housing and utilities tariffs in Russia have increased by almost 12%, and in some regions more than 20%. For millions of citizens, this meant that utility bills were now eating up a significant portion of their income. However, in order to prevent the slightest doubt about the correctness of the course, the authorities launched digital propaganda in the usual vein. The Botnadzor project has established that almost every 5th comment under news about rising tariffs was left by Kremlin bots. In just a few days, bots published 2,048 messages claiming that price increases were an inevitable benefit. In the comments, Kremlin accounts engaged in rhetoric that makes it hard to decide what is more striking: cynicism or ingenuity. The increase in housing and communal services tariffs is not just a price increase, but a price for stability, one bot insisted with complete seriousness. Other commentators reported that everything was fine because salaries were indexed twice by 14%. This is probably why tens of millions of Russians never noticed this growth in their wallets. Bots working on regional topics try to create the impression that the price increases were not worth much attention, so tariffs, will go up everywhere. Why do they write about the region? One of them reported calmly. Another claimed that against the backdrop of rising salaries, this is not significant. Meanwhile, according to official data, in Perm-Krai, tariffs increased by 21%. In Arkhangelsk Oblast by 20% and Kemerovo Oblast by almost 20%. To give the situation an appearance of seriousness, Economic Development Minister Maxim Reshetnikov assured citizens that the tariffs were macroeconomically justified. First Deputy Chairman of the State Duma Committee Vladimir Koshelev attributed the increase to inflation and the need to update the infrastructure. Of course, none of the officials mentioned that at the same time the state is sending billions to the war and Russians are being offered the consolation of the fact that they are not paying for heat, but for economic greatness. When arguments run out, the Kremlin unleashes an army of bots to repeat the old mantra, "Be patient a little longer," because it's all for the sake of a brighter future. Russia, which once prided itself on being an energy power, now explains to its citizens that utility bills are higher than in Europe. This is the price of stability, and although many Russians are already struggling to make ends meet, in the eyes of propaganda they must perceive this as a special honor. Putin's army attacked the border areas of Sumy region. At the same time, even Russian war correspondents admitted that Ukrainian forces are constantly carrying out counterattacks. Analysts from the Institute for the Study of War have announced the current situation in the region. Z channels report that Russian troops have failed to completely capture Yunakovka, contrary to the Kremlin propaganda. In fact, the occupiers from the 76th Airborne Division control most of the village, but not the entire territory. The representative of the State Border Service of Ukraine, Andriy Demchenko, reported that the enemy is operating in small assault groups in the north of Sumy region. At the same time, the enemy has begun to use motorcycle units less frequently in this section of the front. According to him, the enemy is increasingly using guided bombs and unguided missiles. The main strikes are being carried out on the Yunakivska and Kotin communities of the region. Demchenko also noted that Russian forces are increasingly conducting sabotage operations in the Sumy and Kharkiv regions. One of the Ukrainian fighters said that Russian drones using fiber optics remain the #1 problem for the Ukrainian armed forces. According to him, the enemy has begun to equip drones with electronic warfare systems to make them more difficult to intercept. Military analyst Konstantin Mashovets noted that units of the 11th and 83rd Airborne Brigades of the Russian Federation are having difficulty advancing in the Yablonovka area. Meanwhile, Ukrainian forces have pinned down the actions of the 106th Airborne Division in the north of Sumy region, which has forced the Russian Defense Ministry to postpone plans for its redeployment. In this direction, the Ukrainian armed forces are also fighting with fighters from the Akhmat unit and Smuglyanka drone operators. Ukrainian forces have stabilized the situation in Sumy Oblast and pushed the Russian army further away from Sumy, the region's capital, Ukraine's General Staff reported recently. Moscow launched its new summer campaign in May, aiming to push deeper into Ukraine's northeastern and eastern regions and disregarding Kiev's calls for an unconditional ceasefire. Ukrainian troops advanced near the village of Oleksiivka, located less than 30 kilometers from the city of Sumy, and liberated the village of Andriivka, which had been captured by Russia in early June.